As of 2023, the U.S. was number one in the whole world for oil production. Quite impressive. On average, the country extracts around 19.4 million barrels a day. In second and third places in the rankings with a noticeable gap are Saudi Arabia and Russia. Their figures are around 11 million barrels a day, which is almost half of what the U.S. produces. But at the same time, the USA is in second place among the key oil importers. That is, they actively buy it. Only China buys more crude oil, around 10 million barrels a day, while the USA's number is about 6 million barrels a day. Canada, Mexico, Guyana, and again Saudi Arabia supply oil to the U.S. daily. In fact, there's a pretty long list, give or take 15 countries, and there's nothing unusual about it. It's a big country that doesn't have enough oil of its own and has to buy it from others. After all, the USA is the biggest oil consumer in the world. In 2019, the country consumed about 21 million barrels a day. That's 20% of the global total. 21% for one country. But what if I told you that at the same time, the USA sells a huge amount of oil that it extracts on its own land? Moreover, the USA is among the top 4 largest oil exporters, meaning they sell a lot of crude oil. The country ranks 4th after Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iraq, and sells about 3.6 million barrels of oil each day. And this already seems strange. Why sell oil if you don't have enough and end up having to buy it later? What's up with that? The truth is, the U.S. simply can't use its own oil, and I won't make sense of it without a cup of coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to hit the like button if you do that sort of thing. In 2022, when oil and gas prices in the U.S. began to soar, many people saw a straightforward and apparently obvious solution to the issue. The U.S. has roughly 38.2 billion barrels of known oil reserves underground that remain untapped. Judge for yourself. Almost 14 million acres on land and over 9.1 million acres at sea are currently leased but not used for oil extraction. So why not just extract all that oil? Prices would go down right away and everyone would be thrilled. However, even though this thought might seem really smart, many experts back then said it was just a fantasy. For the U.S. to start fully exploiting and using its own oil, that's just impossible. Moreover, a weird paradox has come up. Even if the U.S. were to extract all its oil, the price of fuel wouldn't change at all. Why? For the same reason that the U.S. can't use its own oil, they can only sell it. A few years back, the U.S. set a record for domestic oil production, and it's just kept growing since. In 2018, for example, the country's oil trade balance was the best it's been in the past 50 years. Moreover, the U.S. already produces enough oil to meet their needs. So in 2020, the U.S. was producing 18.4 million barrels of oil per day and consuming 18.12 million barrels. So there could have been some left over for the future. But how does such a huge import fit into this scenario? To get to the bottom of it, you need to grasp one very important thing. While oil is a major commodity traded globally, nearly no one uses it directly. Oil needs to be processed into fuels, materials, and products that we rely on every day. Just a barrel of oil isn't much use to anyone. However, its physical characteristics, like where the oil is extracted, where the refineries or production facilities are located, or where the highest consumer demand is, affect its usefulness and therefore its value. Yes, oil also comes in different types. Types of oil differ in density, sulfur content, viscosity, presence of impurities, and all that sort of thing. Depending on what exactly you want to produce, you need a certain type of oil with specific characteristics. Based on these characteristics, people decide what to do with the oil they've extracted. But if you really want to put it simply, you can roughly divide oil into light and heavy types. The type of light crude oil that most people are familiar with is less dense than water. It flows easily at room temperature. Heavy oil and bitumen are also forms of crude oil, but they're more viscous and dense. All these differences in oil chemistry mean that you can't purify all oil the same way. The purifying processes look different depending on the type. We've more or less figured out the oil situation, but let's go back to the U.S. and look at the conditions here. It just so happens that most of the infrastructure for oil extraction, as well as refining and transporting fuel, is located in the regions in the middle of the continent and along the Gulf of Mexico coast. By the way, this is the reason why the 5 states where fuel prices are the lowest are the same ones where most of the infrastructure is located. These are Mississippi, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Alabama, and of course Texas. Believe it or not, oil pipelines have been around since the 1860s. Back then, of course, pipes were out of the question. Wagons and flatboats were the most common means of transporting barrels of oil, but the industry needed something better. In 1862, a more modern pipeline was built, which looked, well, nothing like what we have now. Two wooden planks joined in the shape of a V. This pipeline carried oil about 1,000 feet using simple gravity. However, by 1863, an actual iron pipeline was laid in Pennsylvania, stretching 2.5 miles and equipped with pumps. And after that, there was no stopping it. Even today, many states with high demand for motor fuel don't have such modern infrastructure. Instead, they get fuel through shipping, railroads, and trucks. In other words, any way they can, but not through pipelines. But of course, most of the raw oil in the U.S., which is transported over long distances, goes through pipelines. In 2014, there were almost 160,000 miles of interstate pipelines in the United States, and still, they don't reach everywhere. For example, let's take California, a state with the highest population. There are more people here than in the 21 least populous states combined. Pretty clear comparison, right? Even with its population, California is practically an oil island. It has no pipelines linking it to other crude oil producing and refining regions. In addition to its own oil, which isn't very much, California imports roughly 70% of its crude from abroad. The portion coming from other states is very minimal. Why did this happen? Well, actually, it's very complicated. Let's just say it's about geography and political decisions at the state level. It's likely that California will never be connected to the main oil pipeline of the United States, simply because the cost of such a project would be very high. And there's no certainty that oil will be needed. After all, this is California. The state's in the process of transitioning from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. What's the point of oil? But let's get back to the main question. Why doesn't the U.S. use the oil it drills? It turns out it's actually quite simple. The country has reserves of light oil, but it needs heavy oil. Turning heavy oil into high-quality products needs more advanced molecular processing. That's why heavy oil is generally valued lower than light oil. It costs a lot to make it useful. For instance, a few years back, the average price for heavy oil was $54 per barrel, while for light oil it was just over $70 per barrel. However, many American oil refineries are generally set up to process heavy crude oil. This is because a long time ago, the U.S. built its industry to handle just heavy oil. Back then, it helped to expand resources and supply potential. The refineries were literally designed to process oil coming from Mexico and Venezuela, and a large portion of it, usually relatively heavy and with a relatively high sulfur content, but the country's own oil is actually light. So how about modernizing the refineries? Well, no. As of January 1st, 2024, there were 132 active oil refineries in the USA. Modifications to individual refineries cost between $50 and $100 million, and a complete overhaul of the entire plant can cost several billion dollars. In short, it's easy to calculate that modifying all the plants will cost at least $130 to $200 billion. In practice, the amount will likely be much higher due to various accompanying factors. No one's just going to spend such huge amounts of money, and not just because it's insanely expensive, but because of the current government policy. It's aimed at reducing oil extraction and consumption. The U.S. is working towards a gradual shift away from fossil fuels, so institutions are pulling out of the industry, investments are being cut back. In short, all this costly plant modernization is just not needed by anyone. So it turns out that buying someone else's oil is just more profitable than using your own. It seems strange. But right now, by selling their own oil and buying and then refining someone else's, the U.S. makes more money than with any other strategy. Imported oil, even after subtracting transport expenses, is often less expensive than oil extracted domestically. The primary reason is the cost of extracting oil in other countries. It's much lower than in the USA. This cost covers land prices, leasing, labor. In short, in the USA, everything costs a lot more. But that's not the only reason. There's also the Jones Act of 1920, which requires that goods shipped from one U.S. port to another be transported on ships that are built, owned, and manned by Americans. Do you see the problem here? Essentially, getting oil from Texas to the east coast of the U.S. is quite possible, yet oil from Texas goes to Asia, and the east coast gets its oil from across the Atlantic. The reason for these odd routes comes down to cost. Because of the Jones Act requirements, shipping fuel from the Gulf of Mexico to the East Coast costs 3 times more than shipping it from overseas. And this is considering the widely developed port infrastructure that allows using cheap sea transport. But alas, the law is the law. And now let's imagine what would happen if the U.S. decided to use only its own oil from now on. It seems this would immediately lead to a bunch of problems, even without considering how much money it would take to readjust the refineries. Switching solely to light crude oil might not cover some markets, and the hundreds of billions of dollars invested in heavy oil processing would just be lost. Equipment would no longer be needed. In fact, there was even a survey of energy experts, and almost 2/3 of the respondents said that energy independence isn't a reasonable goal. So if the U.S. stops buying oil and uses only its own, it won't lead to anything good. If a miracle happened and American oil refineries could instantly start processing local light oil, it would still result in huge expenses, simply because this oil comes out of the ground in the wrong places. So there's just no infrastructure to get the oil to the refineries. And without it, all the extraction for local use becomes pointless. But here's the interesting part. In the U.S., there's its own heavy oil and so-called oil sands, mainly in California, Alaska, and Utah. However, extracting and processing them requires more energy and water than lighter oil, and again, it's simply more expensive. Plus, there's too little of this oil, about 10% of the total amount, and it just won't cover the demand. If there were enough deposits, it would still be more expensive to develop them than to buy foreign oil. And it's not just about the money. It'd take a ton of time, too. Building the necessary drilling rigs takes at least 2 or 3 years. Also, extraction's not the quickest thing. After drilling starts, you can see the oil in about 6 months, or even up to 8, and it's needed all the time, in large quantities. So what do we have in the end? Just stopping buying oil and building all the necessary extraction facilities won't work. The reserves will run out. The country will grind to a halt. Collapse, fuel apocalypse. Starting to build installations in advance and transitioning gradually is too expensive. And with the rise of green energy, it might even be pointless. All for the sake of bears. In April of this year, the U.S. banned drilling for fossil fuels on almost half of the territory of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. This measure is aimed at protecting the environment, as the area under the ban is home to protected species such as polar bears and caribou. Although it's exactly here that the Navy's Underground Emergency Oil Reserve is located, which was established in the early 1920s. But still, protecting the environment won out. The decision to introduce a drilling ban sparked both criticism and approval. And at the same time, the realization that everything is constantly changing. Even old oil sources can suddenly become off limits. What sort of plant overhaul are we even talking about? U.S. in first place. According to stats, in 2023, the U.S. produced more oil than any other country in any other year on record. It's clear that with the advancement of technology, the oil industry is also growing, and there's a rising demand on top of that. But the states keep breaking records. As a result, in August 2024, oil production in the U.S. reached 13.4 million barrels a day. Nobody's ever pumped that much. Let them just stand for now. When oil and gas wells are no longer in use, operators are required to seal them to prevent leaks. It makes sense. Leaks cause too many problems. Methane, oil, and other pollutants can contaminate everything around. However, about 14,000 idle wells in U.S. waters in the Gulf of Mexico remain unsealed. They just stand there. It's all because shutting down all these wells, which usually means sealing them with cement, could cost about $30 billion. So it seems the well owners are just waiting and hoping for the best. Oil diving. While some oil structures pose a potential threat to ecosystems, others can turn into a real haven for marine life. The metal platforms used for drilling oil wells over the years take on an amazingly different role. They become artificial reefs. That's how they spend their retirement. And with all the sea life around, old oil rigs are turning into popular places for divers and snorkelers. That makes sense. There's definitely a lot to see. Well, as usual, you owe me a like since you finished watching. See you later.